It's important to bear in mind that there's a difference between reconciliation and forgiveness. Forgiveness is something that we do for ourselves. It doesn't even require that we talk to the person that harmed us. We can have negative thoughts about that person that we translate into positive thoughts, and we can pray for that person. There are things we can do in our Christian faith that can help us overcome unforgiveness towards a person without ever talking to that person. I think that's one of the things that slows people down from being forgiving, is because they think that if I forgive the person, then I'm going to be condoning their behavior, or I'm going to have to be friends with them again, or in the case of an abuse in a marriage, I'm going to have to keep living with the person that's abusing me. And all of those are myths. Those are not what forgiveness is.
What is going on, everybody? Guys, welcome back this week to another amazing, very, very exciting, but most importantly, a very important conversation that we're having this week on the show. But if we're jumping into introducing today's guest and conversation, guys, let me just start off by reminding you how incredibly grateful and thankful we are to have you here with us. As always, guys, I'm your host, Frank Rich, and this is the Superhuman Life, the only podcast that is dedicated to helping men become better men by quitting porn and rebuilding their lives in 90 days. And we do that by bringing on guests like today's guest, experts from all around the world to provide you with the tools, tactics, and strategies to unlock greatness in your own life. Today's conversation is one that is needed, very, very needed for all of us. And I'll start by posing a question to you. Are you holding on to unforgiveness in your life right now? Is there somebody that has done something to you, or you've perceived has done something to you, that you just can't forgive them? You've got to constantly hold on to this grudge. Maybe you're not going to get back at them, but you're just not going to forgive them. Or maybe there is somebody that you're just waiting for that right time to get back at them for what they've done. Well, if any of those are yes, then today's conversation is needed. But more importantly, if the answer to those questions was a no, you still probably need to stick around for today's conversation, because all of us probably have some unmet forgiveness, some unfinished forgiveness in our lives that we need to work through. So on today's episode, guys, we have one of the world's leading experts on the topic of forgiveness, Dr. Ronald Ramsey. Dr. Ronald Ramsey is a clinical chaplain retired from corporate life after a 25-year career as an organizational development consultant specializing in large-scale cultural change. Now, after earning a doctorate in family therapy, he went on to work as a licensed marriage and family counselor in his private practice. And then in 2017, he completed the requirements of the Association for Clinical Pastoral Education for hospital chaplaincy with additional trainings in palliative care chaplaincy. The majority of his work since has been with patients receiving palliative care and their families. Now, Dr. Ramsey is the author of the powerful book, 40 Days to Forgiveness, a Christian's field guide to the forgiveness journey. The book draws on Ron's experiences as an organizational development consultant, his knowledge of the behavioral sciences and theological studies, and his own unforgiveness challenges, which he shares with us in such an emotional part of today's conversation, to lead these readers through life-changing forgiveness journey. So in this conversation, we start by defining what is forgiveness and what is the forgiveness that we're talking about in today's conversation. Just getting really, really clear on some of these terms, which I think is important. We then go down the path of Ron's own struggle and journey of getting into writing this book and having some of these own issues come up to the surface. Such a powerful part of this conversation where Ron shares his own journey. We then get into some of the myths and some of the false claims around forgiveness and why we need a process and why we need a structure like what is taught in the 40 days of forgiveness. We then unpack the differences between divine forgiveness, self-forgiveness, interpersonal forgiveness, and then we walk you through Ron's action model and so much more. So guys, if forgiveness is something that you've been struggling with, if forgiveness is something that maybe somebody in your life is struggling with, stick around for today's conversation, but most importantly, go check out Ron's book, guys. We linked it down there in the show notes. But let's get into today's conversation with none other than Dr. Ron Ramsey on unpacking the 40 days of forgiveness, the Christian's field guide to the forgiveness journey. Hope you guys enjoy, and we'll see you on the other side. Dr. Ramsey, welcome to the Superhuman Life.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm really, really looking forward to today's conversation. The timing of this, I know we had originally planned to record this last week or a couple of weeks ago. And for the audience knowing this, we're recording this on a Monday afternoon. And I'll share with you here, Ron. So just this past weekend, I'm a part of a men's group. We meet every Saturday morning. It's fellowship. Incredible group of guys. We lift each other up, pray. We get into serious conversations. Sometimes it's just really kind of a passive thing where we're just all meeting and just kind of sharing what's on our heart. But out of nowhere, Ron, this past week, and the individual that usually leads the group was away. So he had somebody kind of stepping in to run this call. And we get through the first 5-10 minutes of just kind of what's been going on. How's the weekend? How's the week? What's going on with the family? And Chris, who was leading this past weekend's call, he said, I have a topic for today. Let's talk about forgiveness. And like out of nowhere, it was like, wow, it's so needed. And then yesterday at service, it was Mother's Day here, and the sermon was centered around, there was a forgiveness component, forgiving of your generational curses and your generational sins. Like we have to be able to forgive the things that have been passed down through us, through genetics, through lineage, through programming. So like I said, Ron, because of your book is called 40 Days to Forgiveness, and just the themes over this past weekend in my life, I'm so excited to explore your work, get underneath some of your ideas, and really hopefully give the audience some real actionable stuff to walk away with here today. So I think where I would really love to start with you is, why is forgiveness such an important conversation first that we all need to have? But why do so many people struggle with it? So I guess it's really a two-part question. Why is forgiveness so important for us to converse, talk about, and have as a part of our life? And then yet at the same time, with it being so important, why do so many people struggle with it?
Well, I think for starters, I would want to say that we need to be clear about what we're talking about relative to forgiveness when we're talking about my book. 40 Days to Forgiveness is about interpersonal forgiveness. It's not about self-forgiveness. It's not about divine forgiveness. When I was doing some research on this topic in my doctoral studies, what I learned is that there are a lot of books out there on divine forgiveness, God's forgiveness of us. There weren't any Christian books. Well, I shouldn't say any. I did run into one recently, but there's not very many Christian books on interpersonal forgiveness. And I believe that our relationships with other people is the one thing that we're going to take with us when we go to heaven.
Yeah, can you expand on that? What you mean there?
Well, when we get to heaven, we're going to be interfacing with people that we knew on earth. We're told that we'll be known as we are known. And so forgiving people while we're still here on earth, I think, is an important element of reuniting with people when the day comes that we get to heaven. But part of the reason why I thought it was an important topic was when I was studying for my doctorate in marriage and family therapy, I wanted to come up with a topic that would make a significant contribution to the church. And at first, I thought about studying family resilience. But as I dug into that a little bit, what I realized is that one of the primary issues that families deal with that affects their resilience is unforgiveness. And I see a lot of it in families around me. And they appear to be unresolvable. I'm not even sure if they came to me as a marriage counselor, if there would be a willingness on their part to try and resolve the unforgiveness they're experiencing. So, because forgiveness is such a core piece in family harmony, and families are such a core foundation to the church, that's what I thought would make the most impact in the church today.
Yeah, no, that's great. And clearly kind of from, the way that I, opened up, today's conversation, it's obviously, it's a conversation that is regularly had, yet we still seem to have issues and struggle with it. And I want to kind of, go a little bit deeper into the interpersonal, the divine, the self forgiveness. Maybe where we should actually go now though is, like, what do you actually mean? Like when you talk about forgiveness, like, have you come up with your own definition of forgiveness that you use in the book? Is it something that you've pulled from somewhere else? Let's define what forgiveness ultimately is so we can understand that as a context for the rest of today's conversation.
Well, there is not a commonly agreed on definition in the behavioral sciences, but all the definitions share some common elements. And in my book, 40 Days to Forgiveness, I really talk about forgiveness from the point of view of having ruminations about things, negative things that we would intend to play out on our transgressor if we have the opportunity. So when we're transgressed, it affects our emotions and our feelings, and we have to cope with those feelings. And if we're not able to cope with them, then we start to think about what happened to us. And as we think about it, we begin to develop ideas about what we'd like to do. We begin to rehearse ideas in our mind. And as we rehearse those ideas, we develop a narrative, a story about what happened to us. And that just keeps going in a circle. I call that a vicious cycle of unforgiveness. The more we ruminate, the more the story grows and the more difficult it is to break it. It's almost like a habit. And habits, as you've probably heard, take about 21 days plus or minus to break. So the more we think about how we've been transgressed, the more difficult it is for us to overcome it.
Yeah. Breaking and changing habits is the world that I live in. And I think there's actually a lot of newer research coming out that it's not 21 days. I had Dr. Caroline Leaf on the it's like a year and a half ago. Inventor of the neurocycle. A lot of her work is kind of groundbreaking in the neuroplasticity. It's actually 3 cycles of 21 here. So knowing that we have these narratives replaying, like we're thinking about, I kind of like what I heard there. It's like we're thinking about paying back the transgressor
Right.
with some other act. So
Right.
Where does a person need to be at, or like what is a sign that you need to have forgiveness in your life? Like, is there a process, or is there something that people can identify in their own thoughts and their own narratives in their own life of, hey, you have some unforgiveness here, or you have some forgiveness that is needed? Where do they know? Where do they go?
First of all, I think what I just said is a sign that you're stuck in a vicious loop of unforgiveness. When you can't get the thoughts out of your head, when you have negative intentions about the person that harmed you, when you've been treated unfairly or unjustly. What I would say, however, is that not all forgiveness is targeted at someone that's a contemporary, somebody that's still around. And sometimes unforgiveness isn't even targeted at a single transgression. People that have experienced ongoing transgressions, abuse, like my sexual abuse I experienced as a child, it's a little bit of a different story, but I think it's the same process of overcoming it and forgiving the people that have harmed us. Being aware of the harm that's been done and being aware of how we are reacting to it is a core part of knowing that you're in an unforgiveness cycle.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you bringing up your own your own past. I think maybe there's an opportunity here to maybe explore some of your journey that actually led you to here. That's one of the things that I think makes some of these conversations so powerful. Yeah, we can unpack all the ideas. Like, we got one of the world's leading experts on forgiveness here, right? We can talk about all the strategies. I got a list of questions here, but I want people to pick up the book because I know how great the book is, and I know it's an actionable guide. I think adding some context to maybe drive them to the book. So are you open to maybe talking a little bit about your journey through forgiveness and kind of how that led you to writing this book?
Well, first of all, I was raised in a very fundamentalist Christian church. And I was raised to believe that if people didn't go to the same denomination that I went to, they weren't going to go to heaven. And so I was raised with a very judgmental, jaundiced eye towards people. And it wasn't until I worked on being a chaplain that I was able to really fully overcome that and to forgive the people that laid that heavy burden on me. So as a chaplain, you have to be able to work with people of any religion. You have to be able to work with people with no religion. And so being able to be non judgmental was a challenge for me. And it's still a challenge. The thing about forgiveness is you never totally overcome the transgression that's occurred to you. You can always get triggered even after you've forgiven and fall back into the same cycle again, just like an alcoholic can fall back into drinking again if they take one drink. So there are things that can trigger us. But so I get triggered and I get judgmental and I don't like that piece about me. So that's one element of my history. The other is I didn't really get fully in touch. Sorry.
Take your time.
I didn't really get fully in touch with the sexual abuse until about 4 years ago, after I had already put 3 years worth of work into the book. And I had some impressions of what happened, things that happened to me as a child, but I was very, very young. And it was through counseling that I was able to unearth that and deal with it. So I've had to work on unforgiveness in my own life over childhood traumas. And that's been a journey. It's still a journey.
Yeah, no, thank you for opening up here. I can clearly see um, how difficult and emotional this is making you. So I, I'm curious here. Like, you set out on this book journey. You said a lot of these things that kind of come to surface in the process in your own life. What was the original kind of mission behind writing the book? Like where did that originally start from?
People think I'm a little crazy when I say this, but I feel like God called me to write it. I see a lot of unforgiveness in couples that I work with. Oftentimes, more often than not, at the core of the issues that couples are dealing with is some kind of unforgiveness for each other. And I see it in patients that I work with in the hospital. And the unforgiveness is something that keeps them in a sick state, makes it more difficult for them to recover and to move on with their life. But I think my original reason, like I talked about before, was I wanted to do something that I felt like would make a difference in the church today. And the church gets accused of being very judgmental. And as we know, attendance at churches is falling off with the younger generation. And part of what they object to is how self-righteous and judgmental Christians tend to be. And I can say that because I am that way. That's something that I have to work on and overcome all the time. So I believe that learning to be forgiving and learning to accept other people for who they are, seeing people as individuals separate from the transgression that they've committed, is something that's important, that's needed in the church today. So I wanted to make a contribution.
Yeah, no, and it's great, and it's much needed, and I highly respect the mission and purpose behind what you're trying to do. I talk about it a lot with our work, right? And it's one of the things that I'm doing is actually partnering with one of the local mega churches here to roll out a program for men struggling with porn because the issue is not being handled and addressed there as well. So I think that's incredible, amazing. I want to ask you about the transition from you spent 25 years in kind of corporate America, like organizational leadership, project management, kind of building on the operations side of things. And I believe it was around the time of almost being ready to retire that you walked away from that career and then got into family therapy and all the things that you're doing now. Did you feel the call back then? Like, was that the original call that you felt? And how did your background in operations in a corporate environment assist you in the therapy work that you've been doing?
Well, that's a good question. My first job out of college was a youth minister. And when I was a youth minister, I didn't like any of the educational materials that were being developed for teenagers. So I started writing my own materials. And then they asked me to do a children's Bible hour, and I started, during the church service. So I started writing all those materials too. And what I realized is that I liked putting together educational materials. So I went back to school to work on a master's degree in that field. And while I was there, one of my professors referred me to a former student, and they hired me. And there I was in corporate America. And I was there for 25 years. And my career kind of progressed from doing general training and development to working in operations, doing leadership development. Um, In my last job, we worked on implementing the Toyota production system in in a large manufacturing company. So I saw in corporate America, I saw a lot of people carrying around and harboring grudges and wanting to make paybacks and trying to get even with other people and a lot of gamesmanship. And I realized that that wasn't the kind of world that I wanted to live in. But that was another thing that influenced me wanting to write about forgiveness because I saw how debilitating it could be to productivity in an organization. So while I was there in 2002, I decided to start back to school. Did school online, took one class or two classes at a time. And then I ended up retiring in 2007. And at that time, then I went to school full time, finished up my degree in 2011.
And that got you into the family the
Marriage
family
counseling.
therapy, the marriage counseling.
Yeah, I wanted to focus on marriages as opposed to family systems. Um, I really made a decision, and it was a hard decision. My wife and I talked about it at length, but I made the decision not to keep working as a consultant in corporate America and to completely change what I was doing to a totally different career. And so that's the career I chose, marriage counseling.
Yeah, so you talked about, you saw grudges being held. Were you always in like manufacturing facilities, kind of like blue collar type of environments? Was that kind of like where a
No,
large amount of your, okay,
no,
so it's all over.
I worked mostly with the senior leadership. So the
Okay,
executive vice president, senior vice presidents, plan managers, people that report directly to plan managers.
got it. And even at that level, you're experiencing these grudges and
Oh
kind of
yeah.
like this need. Okay.
Oh yeah. People are carrying them with them all the time.
So nobody's immune, no matter what level of success that you're
No,
at. Whether you're sitting in the corner office, CEO pulling in a 7-figure salary, or you're working the line, $15 an hour, pulling and pushing buttons. It's universal to the human condition, the need for forgiveness.
right. Absolutely.
So what makes the difference between a secular kind of view of forgiveness and then what your book teaches, or the work that you do here for more the Christian view?
Well, the secular view of forgiveness really centers around empathy, having empathy for the person that's transgressed you. And that's sort of the core of the approach. I mean, there's different, depending on whose model you look at, there are different steps that they suggest going through. But all of those steps center around empathy. As Christians, our ability to be empathic should be greater than people who are not walking in faith. And so the approach that I take centers around building spiritual maturity. So there's a significant part of the book where I talk about how we go about building spiritual maturity. I did some research on it, and there's different points of view on spiritual disciplines and spiritual maturity. But what I did is I narrowed it down to four things: scripture study, meditation, prayer, and fellowship. And if we build ourselves up and strengthen ourselves in those four things, we will naturally be more forgiving as people. What's interesting is that the Bible doesn't actually have any examples of interpersonal forgiveness in it, which I thought was interesting when I started studying this. I never saw anybody say that in a book. I just found it out by doing my own research. And I believe the reason for that is because God wants us to mirror his forgiveness of us towards other people. We're told to forgive as Jesus forgave. And there's a slight difference between what we're told to do with other members of the church versus people in the world that are not members of the church, referred to as neighbors. Whenever we forgive within the church, we're also commanded to reconcile. We're not commanded to necessarily reconcile with people that we're not sharing our faith with. And that's another interesting point that I didn't realize until I started studying this. And it's important to bear in mind that there's a difference between reconciliation and forgiveness. Forgiveness is something that we do for ourselves. It doesn't even require that we talk to the person that harmed us. We can have negative thoughts about that person that we translate into positive thoughts, and we can pray for that person. And there are things we can do in our Christian faith that can help us overcome unforgiveness towards a person without ever talking to that person. But I think that's one of the things that slows people down from being forgiving, is because they think that if I forgive the person, then I'm going to be condoning their behavior, or I'm going to have to be friends with them again. Or in the case of an abuse in a marriage, I'm going to have to keep living with the person that's abusing me. And all of those are myths. Those are not what forgiveness is. Forgiveness doesn't mean letting people off the hook and not being accountable for their behavior, but it does mean letting go of the getting evenness that we're carrying around with ourselves.
Yeah, this is really interesting kind of view and perspective. I'll be honest. Like I haven't, prior to, getting ready for this, forgiveness is not something that I think I've really spent a lot of time working through. And I don't and I'm not sure why, Ron. Like I don't feel like I have anything that I'm holding onto. I know that I'm struggling with maybe some of the self forgiveness, like about my past. So to maybe kind of share, just so you know, like my story. I wasn't raised a Christian. I was saved a little over almost 3.5 years ago. So October 2018. And then even when you talk about, like how your example of like forgiveness is not something that is a big part of the church, and the church is judgmental. That was not my experience. Like I was brought to Christ through some of the most amazingly strong, powerful, loving men. Like my first examples in my adult life that I can recall of Christian men were like shining examples of what I wanted to be in this world. Like guys that were on fire for Christ, but they had bigger purposes that we're working towards. They were all entrepreneurs. Their businesses were kind of the way that they brought their good into the world, and they use it as a way to shine the light of Christ. But at the same time, these are strong men that led their families, lead their communities. So these were my examples from the beginning. Now, as I've kind of, become a Christian and now put myself, more into some of these circles, I see more of the example that you described at the beginning. But for me, that wasn't the entry point. So I wrestle with like understanding a lot of these things from a fundamental level. I see that it happens out there, but it's not my narrative. It's not my worldview. Like I see Christian men as like the men that's like we're all called to be. These are the men that I want to be examples, and it's how I try to live my life out here as well. So forgiveness for me is not something that I've wrestled with externally of needing to forgive other people. I don't have payback in mind. I'm not playing any of these stories. I do wrestle with, like, because I lived 35 years, like being a degenerate, like and really good at it. Like, am I forgiven for some of my past? So I know you said at the beginning that your book is on the interpersonal forgiveness, and it's not the divine forgiveness or the self forgiveness. But I'm assuming, based on kind of what we're getting to here, that you have to have an understanding of these two, or you at least have to have a foundation in divine forgiveness and self forgiveness in order for the interpersonal forgiveness to work. So I'm not really giving you a clear question here to work through. Maybe you can kind of just expand some of your own thoughts based on what I've just thrown here at you.
Well, I don't believe that self-forgiveness or divine forgiveness is a whole lot different from interpersonal forgiveness. It's just that it would have been very confusing in one book to try and deal with all three.
Okay.
But I think the approach that I take, the steps that I take in the process would apply to a person. Could take that process that I've described in 40 Days of Forgiveness, and they could creatively apply it to their own life. They could apply it to feeling angry at God and feeling like God's dealt them a dirty hand, or it could be applied to feeling like they've made so many mistakes and have so many regrets in their life that they need to overcome. I think the same process applies. It's just that in the book, as you read it, it talks more about someone that's transgressed us, someone that's harmed us in some way. It doesn't mean that the process doesn't still apply in other ways, but it just is. When you write a doctoral dissertation, you have to really fine tune your focus. You have to narrow it down. So as I narrowed my focus down, I narrowed it down to interpersonal forgiveness.
Yeah, I'd love to unpack your process here here in a minute. I have a question around ego. I don't know if it's something you address here, but it's something that came up in the conversation I was having with the men that I meet with on Friday. And as we're kind of exploring this conversation, like it keeps popping up, like ego, like God dealt me a bad hand. That's my ego, right? Like that's me getting in front of my own way, saying, you know what, God, like you did this to me. If I'm holding on to something else that somebody has done to me, or I'm perceiving they've done it to me, that's my ego. That's me saying I'm more important than I'm at, me trying to appear more important in this world than I really am. Like that person probably didn't actually set out to do this thing personally to me. They're probably navigating their own life blindly, walking through, not even knowing what's going on. So what role is our ego playing in our inability to forgive, and how do we get out of our ego to actually go down this process of beginning to forgive somebody?
Well, that's a good characterization, a good question. We all carry around a desire to protect ourselves. I don't know if I would necessarily call it ego. I think our ego can get involved, but it's human nature to want to protect ourselves from harm. So when we feel someone is trying to harm us in some way, we go into a combative mode, or we go into a runaway mode, or we can just freeze like a turtle and pull our head in our shell and try and act like it's not happening. And when we start doing that, our self-centeredness, our focus on taking care of ourselves becomes the fuel that fuels how we're trying to protect ourselves. It amplifies the way we're trying to protect ourselves. And we start telling ourselves stories that characterize and make the transgression that we've experienced something that we feel justifies the kind of response that we want to have towards people, what I call negative intentions. There's definitely a role for our self-centeredness, or ego as you're calling it, in trying to protect ourselves and trying to maintain a sense of well-being in our own lives.
Yeah. So does that get us to now, I guess, what would be your action model, like your process for actually going through the unforgiveness? Let's maybe unpack that a little bit if we can. Because okay, so we've identified here, you know, whether it's self-centeredness, ego, like that's, you know, I don't know if that's a union term, but I think we're kind of on the same page. Whether it's self-centeredness, just our like what we do to protect ourselves, like I see that as our ego, and I'm not saying ego is a negative thing. Like it's fundamental, it's needed, because if we didn't have it, then we would just all kind of mesh together. So we need to have this like the separator between us and everything else. And I see that as ego. Maybe the terminology isn't exactly the same. But once we've identified this, okay, this is me in my own way here. But now I need to go down this process because I'm having these visions, I'm having these stories, these narratives about this payback thing that I want to do somebody. Once they're there, where do they go? What's your process? Is it the action model? Let's kind of unpack that a little bit if we can.
Yeah, I use the word action as an acronym for the steps in the forgiveness process. The A stands for acknowledging that there's been a transgression against me, and acknowledging how it's affected me, how it's making me treat other people, how it's making me show up in the world, how it's making me feel. So until we really fully unpack what's happened to us and acknowledge it at a deeper level, it's difficult to move forward with being forgiving. The second step is commitment, which all of the research that I've read points to commitment as being a pretty central step in the process. Unless we make a commitment in our own mind to try to forgive someone, odds are we're not going to forgive them. We're not going to be able to get there. The T stands for transitioning from the ruminating thoughts, transitioning from the negative thoughts and negative intentions to positive thoughts and positive intentions towards the transgressor. And this is another case where the transgressor could be myself. I can be a transgressor towards myself. So shifting my thinking is part of the transitioning process. The I stands for internalization. And that's where I talk about spiritual maturity. When we internalize the light of Christ in our hearts, as we break down the strongholds that are around our heart, we allow the light of Christ to shine out of us towards other people, particularly people that have transgressed us, treated us unfairly in some way. The O stands for openness, being open to making the change, changing ourselves, not trying to change the other person who's harmed us, but being open to changing ourselves and being open to continuing to work on our unforgiveness over time. Because once you've experienced unfairness or unjustness, you can't unexperience it. You, there's no such thing as forgiving and forgetting. The thoughts are going to be there in our mind forever. And the last step is nurturing the positive thoughts, nurturing the way of thinking and the more positive narrative for all time, because we can get triggered and go back into being unforgiving again if we don't nurture all of the work that we've done in the first steps of the action model.
Yeah. Now, something you've said here a couple times that's really jumping out to me is these thoughts are always going to be there. I'm curious, like your take or opinion on like rewriting the meaning to those things, though, right? Like, is that essentially what we're getting at here? Is like we need to rewrite the meaning of these events in our life, and that is the process of forgiveness. Because yeah, you can't change the event that happened, whether it was 10, 20 years ago. The event is always going to be the same. The memory of this happened at this time will always be there. Is what you're aiming to do is rewrite the meaning of what that event actually meant to you, your life, and your story? Is that what we're trying to get to? And is that why you keep saying like you can't keep the thought from reemerging, but I guess you're changing the story around it? Am I hitting on anything there?
Yeah, you're describing one whole chapter in the book.
Okay.
There's one chapter in the book where it's primarily focused around rewriting your story.
Got
And
it. Okay.
You go back to the other worksheets that you've done in the book and you draw from those to help you rewrite your narrative.
Yeah. Now, when you're given the action model, the ACTION, you really, what I felt, you really put an emphasis on C, commitment. Like I put a major focus on our work as well. Like you're not going to quit porn for good unless you're truly committed. But I also believe that once you make that decision and commitment, there's only going to be a handful of reasons as why you won't succeed. So once somebody starts down this process of forgiving, what would keep somebody from actually reaching forgiveness?
Not having a process. Time doesn't heal all wounds, but time with process can heal our unforgiveness. And so that's what I've tried to do in the work that I've done, in the research that I've done, is I've tried to create a process that we can use over time. That's why the book is called 40 Days to Forgiveness, and that's why it's broken into 40 sections, so that you take each baby step, one step at a time, to move you towards your ultimate goal of rewriting your narrative and then nurturing a different frame of mind going forward.
Yeah. So is that the cycle then? Is the book meant to be? Is it a 40-day kind of exploration, or is it just 40 steps? And then how long is it going to take?
No, it's an exploration.
Okay.
It's an exploration. There's worksheets in it which I call journal exercises. So the book is intended to be a journal of your journey towards forgiveness. And there's actually a part at the end in chapter 7 where you're nurturing your unforgiveness. There's a part in there that helps you know where to go back in the book and revisit some of your journal exercises if you ever get triggered in the future and fall back into the same unforgiving story.
Now, do you find when people go through this, because it sounds like you in the writing process, like it smoked out some issues that you weren't even aware of. Like, I don't know how many, how much feedback you've gotten on the book. So I know it's fairly new. Are you getting people saying like, I thought I was going to this book for one thing, and once I got into some of these worksheets, like all these other issues like from my past started to like reappear? Like, is that anything of the feedback that they're getting, or is that what people can expect? Like once you really begin to peel back the layers, I tell all the guys that I work with, I'm like, you guys are coming to me because you think you have a problem with pornography. Once we begin to actually peel back some of these layers, we're getting to the actual root cause here. So is your book written in kind of a similar way? Like, is it going to bring out like some of these other issues to the surface?
Well, I don't have anybody that's told me that that's happened. What I have had is people have told me that they're reading my book, which means they're not really doing the worksheets and they're not doing the work. And I've asked them, do you feel like it's helping you? And they say, kind of a tentative, yeah, I'm finding it interesting. But if you go, the book is designed so that there's a short reading and then there's a worksheet. And really the worksheets are what forgiveness centers around, being able to be forgiving. In fact, the worksheets are so important that I created a separate workbook so that if someone wanted to not write in the book that they are reading, they could use the workbook, and then the workbook becomes a more manageable journal that they can carry with them, that they can refer back to. But when people don't go through and do the hard work of looking at themselves and trying to respond to the kinds of things that we need to think about when we're trying to be forgiving, I don't know how beneficial the book's really going to be for them.
Yeah. So there's a good question there is where does the person need to be at in order to maybe have this book, like, I don't want to say like succeed, right? Because I know like if you follow the steps, like it's going to succeed. But for me, like a lot of my journey, and I always lean into some of these talking points because I think it's just easy for me to reference this. And I think I'm going to be able to tie a correlation here. But for me, like in my late 20s and early 30s, like I was blinded by some of my own success, like that I had an actual problem. And I've seen it in a lot of the men that sometimes reach out, they leave comments, but they don't join the program. They're like, you know what? I don't really have this big of an issue because look at my life. I got success. I got a great job, corporate, family, cars, all these things. Like, so as men, sometimes we struggle. And I know your book is written for men and women, but there's a person obviously needs to be at the point where they've acknowledged that there is something that they need to be forgiven on. And probably even before they pick up the book or actually begin to work through the book, they also have to be committed as well. So where does the person actually need to be? Like, do they need to be at the point where their unforgiveness is manifesting in physical symptoms, mental issues, the inability to move forward in life? Like, I know this is not a scientific question here. It's going to be more your opinion. Like, where do you think the person needs to be in their life to get the most out of the book?
Well, I think being aware, being self-aware that there's someone in your life that you're holding resentment towards, and not being able to let go of that, not being able to get your head off of that, is certainly a good place for people to be starting at. But I don't think it's necessarily required. I think there's the kind of forgiveness where you forgive someone of an episode of unfairness or transgression or hurtful behavior towards you. But there's also something called forgivingness, which is our tendency to be forgiving people, to be the kind of people that can not take on feeling like victims all the time. And we can also use the journal in the book to help us just be a more forgiving person in general.
What would be reasons why people don't want to forgive?
Well, I think you said it earlier. Their ego. They've developed a story in their mind about how they're right and the other person is wrong, and trying to take control and justify taking control of trying to fix the problem with the other person on their own without forgiving them is just human nature. It's human nature for us to want to protect ourselves. And the more we can control the way that we're protecting ourselves, the more confident we feel that we'll get to where we want to be. But in reality, the more we try to control things without having a process to follow, the more likely it is we're going to fall deeper in the hole.
Yeah, and you did such a beautiful job at the beginning of kind of painting, the eternal picture of why we need forgiveness. So, let's not go that far. Let's keep it, here in this lifetime. Like, what's the outcome if we don't? Like, yeah, you know what? It's not that big of a deal. This person did this thing. I'm going to hold on to this grudge. I'm never going to actually act on it. I'm always going to have the image, but I'm not going to act. How is that going to hold me back from achieving success in life, or from, yeah. So what happens if I don't forgive here?
Well, unforgiveness, you can't have unforgiveness towards one person and not have it affect every area of your life. Unforgiveness has a tremendous impact on just about every aspect of our life: our health, our relationships with other people, our ability to focus on work and be successful in what we're doing, how we feel about our own selves. Unforgiveness touches everything in your life. And you can't be unforgiving towards one person and then totally be loving towards everybody else. You might think you can do it, but in reality, whatever the grudge is that you're carrying from one person will affect how you treat other people in your life to a greater or lesser degree.
Yeah, two things the audience has heard me say here probably hundreds of times is how you do one thing is how you do everything. Like if you're, we talk about it from more of a kind of growth perspective, like clean up your room. If you have a messy environment, it's a product of a messy mind. So a lot of principles taught there. How you do one thing is how you do everything. The second one is you cannot you cannot transfer to one that which you are not experiencing yourself. Meaning, like if you're trying to pass along love or joy or happiness to somebody, but it's coming from a place of unforgiveness, you're transferring to that person the energy, the feeling, the expression of unforgiveness, not the expression of love. So I'm so seeing eye to eye with you there. Talk about some of the health effects. Like, how does it impact our health? You said that there's some research supporting this.
The mind is a powerful thing. And when our mind is troubled, it affects our body. It's all connected. Probably one of the most profound studies that I read was about a study where they did forgiveness coaching with people that had cancer to see if it would have any effect on them. And they had one group of people that they worked with to identify unforgiveness in their life and to overcome it. And then they had another group of people that they just worked with in general to help them spiritually. And what they found is that the people that were able to address unforgiveness that they were carrying in their life were able to heal quicker, go into recidivism, and were able to get their cancer more under control than the other group. I think that's one of the most profound studies that I read.
Yeah. Wow. And then, obviously relationships, we know how that's going to impact itself. Focus is as well. So your response when I asked the question, like, why wouldn't somebody succeed or why wouldn't they successfully forgive, was due to lack of a process. So can you tell us a little bit about what makes, the process in 40 days to forgiveness different than the other processes that are out there? Like, what's unique about what you teach?
Well, of course, I come at it from a Christ-centered point of view. There are about 800 scripture references in my book, as well as references to behavioral science research that's been done. So that's one thing that makes my book different. But I think another thing that makes it different is that I've operationalized it. I've broken it down into bite-sized chunks, into steps. And I've done it in a way where you create a journal of your journey towards forgiveness that you can go back to and refer to either help you through other episodes of unforgiveness, learning from what you did when you went through this book and applying it to other episodes, or just going back if you get triggered again on the same issue that you've experienced that you're going through this book to try and resolve. So I think operationalizing the forgiveness process is probably the thing that I would say is the most unique about the book.
Yeah, and I think that's bringing your unique expertise, background, skill set. Obviously, having 25 years in kind of organizational development, I can't imagine that there's a lot of counselors, therapists, chaplains that have that. So I can definitely see where that's going to be a huge separator in your book, your work, and then any of the ones out there. Another thing I really love about you is the linking between the science and scripture. It's something we talk a lot about here is as well. So if you can kind of share, what is the science supporting from the scripture, how you kind of merging these two in your book, and why is that such an important thing for forgiveness, to have both the Christ-centered outlook, but then also supporting it through research? Because right, some people are going to see like, no, these things they're opposing forces. They're not meant to be talked about at the same time. But I love that you bring them in and you're referencing both. So why is it important, and what is the research, supporting from the scripture side of things?
Well, I think God expects us to understand the world that we live in, and science is one of the ways that we do that. So looking at research and studies that have been done on forgiveness helped me to illuminate some of the steps in the process that are going to make a difference for people, and provided some evidence that a step would be useful. The dissertation that I wrote was actually on the topic of what are the interventions that are most helpful to people when they're trying to forgive. And those interventions came in part from studies that I read about that had been done, but the interventions also came from understanding what kind of heart we're supposed to have as Christians who are trying to walk a life like Christ. And so those two things are complementary of the perspective that I try to bring in the book.
That's fantastic. Ron, where can people get the book? And then where can they learn more about you and your work? And if you're hanging out anywhere socially online, let them know. And then we'll bring today's conversation. We have one last question we like to send every single episode here with, but where can they find the book? And then, plug anything else that you got up and coming, or where people can connect with you if they want to learn more.
Well, of course, it's available at the world's biggest bookstore, Amazon. People can get it there. They can get the workbook there. They can get a Kindle online book if they want. And I'm not sure if it's actually, by the time this airs, there'll be an audiobook as well. I have a website, 40 Days to Forgiveness. You have to spell the word 40 out. If you put the number 40 in, it'll take you to my publisher's website. And that one doesn't tell you very much about me. But there are other podcasts that I've done. There was a workshop that I did, and it tells more about me and my history and my background and so forth. There's also a free giveaway there, so you can go there and sign up for that.
Awesome. And what's up next? Like, is this leading to something bigger for you? Are you going to kind of ride the wave here and continue to do your therapeutic work, or do you see this unlocking greater and bigger things for you?
Well, I'm continuing to counsel. I do all my counseling now online. I was volunteering as a chaplain, and then they decided to hire me. So now I'm working part-time as a chaplain at a local hospital. I've thought about writing another book. This book comes at forgiveness from the perspective of the person that's been harmed. But what about the person that did the harming? What can we do to be people that are kinder, people who don't inflict hurts on other people? How can we walk a journey through this life to be kinder people? And so I thought about writing a book on that topic, and I've started outlining it, but I don't know how far I'll get.
Yeah, well, I think if and when that project ever comes to fruition, I'd love to have you back on, because I think that would be a very powerful conversation, not just for the audience here. I may actually ask, like, there may be some really cool stuff that we could do inside of our men's community, right? Because the men that I'm working with, once again, we're going to talk about pornography here again. I don't know. We probably talked about porn more than you expected, but anyways, obviously they have people in their lives that they feel have been transgressed. So the people think that, look at them as like, okay, you've transgressed upon me due to your issues, struggles, behavior, this and that, sexually, we don't need to explore too much. So I'd be really, really interested and curious about exploring that topic with you. So maybe even if you don't complete the book, maybe we can have you back on to kind of explore that and just have another conversation. But I also want to be respectful for your time and the audience here as well. This has been a really great conversation, Ron. I appreciate you coming on. I appreciate you sharing as much as you did about some of your own struggles. Like I told you at the beginning, I think that really adds a lot of context. It really shows the humanity side of things, right? Like we can get the world's leading experts on all these topics, and we can touch on all these talking points. That's great. Go pick up the book. Like I'm so glad and appreciative we got to meet Dr. Ramsey here a little bit. But we like to end every single episode with one last question. Same question, be a little bit off topic from what we talked about here today. But obviously, the title of the show is The Superhuman Life. And everything that we're doing here is a product of my own journey. It's a walk that I've been on here for almost 4 years now. But when I talk about living a superhuman life, Ron, for me, it's a belief system. It's the way that I try to show up and operate and live out in the world every single day. And it's coming from the place that I do believe that we were all put on this earth for a purpose. There's a calling on each one of our lives. Yours is in this work in forgiveness. Mine is helping the men overcoming pornography. But understanding or believing that you're here for a purpose isn't enough. You need to be intentional. You need to be aggressive. You need to take action every single day towards bringing that purpose to the world to serve other people, to make this world a better place. So that's what I talk about when I talk about living a superhuman life. It's understanding you're here for a purpose, and then it's being intentional about how you're bringing that purpose to make the world a better place. But I like to end the shows here with getting the guest take. So Dr. Ron Ramsey, how would you define living a superhuman life?
Well, first of all, I believe that when we accept Christ and are Christians and are committed to following Christ, that we already have one foot in heaven, and we already have an immortal component to us that makes us superhuman. So we walk in this world with the help and the guidance and the direction from the Father, which we draw from to give ourselves a superhuman presence in the world around us. I believe that when we have a purpose to our life, we live a much richer, fuller existence. In fact, in the research that I did for this book, I learned that their happiness is a result of our commitment to gratitude and to our purpose for why we're put here in the world. And so I believe another way that we live a superhuman life is by living a life of gratefulness and living a life that's committed to a God-given purpose.
That's beautiful. Really, really beautiful said. Guys, you heard it out there. Don't chase happiness, chase purpose, chase service, chase fulfillment in other people's lives, and the happiness will appear. Happiness is fleeting. I mean, like it's here today, gone tomorrow. Purpose is everlasting. Joy is a state that you live and operate out of, and you find that through the act of gratitude. I believe that's a major part of my life and the work that we do. Dr. Ron Ramsey, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for the book. Thank you for all the work that you're doing. Guys, you heard it here today. We all need forgiveness. It's a fundamental part of the struggle that we walk through. And Dr. Ron has created the guidebook, literally the 40 steps. I don't know if they're steps or the 40 days to unlocking the forgiveness in your life. So make sure to go check out the book, get it on Amazon. We'll put all the links down there. And if you want to continue to support the show, we appreciate you guys for sticking around with us here today. You can support us in one of two ways. First off, if you're getting value out of these conversations, make sure to head over to Apple, Spotify, Podbean, wherever you are listening, leave us a 5-star rating and written review. But most important, if there's somebody in your life that needs to hear today's conversation, maybe they're wrestling with unforgiveness in their life. Maybe they're not even aware that they have some unforgiveness that they actually need to go through. So do us the favor and then the blessing by sharing this conversation with them. But for Dr. Ron Ramsey, Frank Rich at The Superhuman Life, we love you guys, and we'll see you next week.